In the autumn of 1238, the village of Ashbourne held a pottery workshop where red clay waited on wooden shelves, and the wheel turned with the same rhythm as the seasons themselves. Here, a potter named Cecilia, 29 years old, shaped vessels with clay-dusty hands and kept her graying auburn hair tucked beneath a linen cap while she worked through the gentle routines that marked her days. Welcome to this peaceful hour of night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to Cecilia's workshop in the English Midlands, following her through the quiet work of preparing clay and turning vessels on her wheel. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. The morning had arrived with mist clinging to the ground outside the workshop, and Cecilia entered through the wooden door as the first pale light touched the eastern sky. The interior held the earthy scent of damp clay, rich and mineral, mixed with the faint smokiness from the kiln that had cooled overnight. She moved across the packed earth floor, her worn leather shoes making barely a whisper against the surface, and began the day's work by checking the pieces that had dried on the shelves since yesterday. Her clay-dusty hands touched each vessel with careful attention, feeling for any cracks or weak spots that might have formed during the night. The workshop air was cool against her face, carrying the promise of rain later, though for now the mist simply softened all the edges of the world beyond the walls. Each pot felt smooth beneath her fingertips, the curved surfaces holding the memory of the wheels turning, and she found herself smiling at the quiet perfection of bowls that would soon be ready for firing. Cecilia, 29, had learned this craft from her father, and her patient nature showed in the way she prepared her workspace without hurry. The wooden table near the window held her tool scrapers made from bone, smoothing stones worn to perfect roundness by years of handling, and thin wire for cutting clay from the larger blocks. Sunlight began filtering through the oiled linen stretched across the window frame, creating a golden glow that made the dust motes visible as they drifted through the air. She made her way to the clay storage area, where large lumps of red earth waited beneath damp cloths to keep them workable. The scent grew stronger here, that distinctive smell of wet clay that spoke of riverbanks and ancient stone. Cecilia unwrapped one portion, revealing the terracotta-colored material that felt cool and yielding under her touch, and she began the process of wedging pressing and folding the clay to remove any air bubbles that might cause problems later. The work demanded steady pressure rather than force, a rhythm of pushing with the heels of her palms and folding the clay back toward herself. Her graying auburn hair caught the morning light when she moved, and the repetitive motion brought a sense of calm that settled over the workshop like the mist outside. She hummed an old tune while working, wordless notes that matched the pace of her hands, and gradually the clay transformed from a rough lump into a smooth, elastic mass ready for the wheel. By the time the church bells rang for terce, marking mid-morning, she had prepared enough clay for several vessels. The sound drifted across the village, bronze tones that seemed to hang in the misty air, and Cecilia paused to wipe her hands on the cloth tucked into her belt. The observant part of her nature noted how the light had shifted, climbing higher through the window and warming the workshop's interior, chasing away some of the dawn chill that had filled the space earlier. Her potter's wheel waited in the center of the room, a circular wooden platform mounted on a vertical shaft, with a larger wheel below that she would kick to maintain momentum. The wood had been worn smooth by countless hours of use, darkened by clay and water and the oil from many hands. Cecilia settled onto the low bench beside it, positioning a wedged portion of clay on the wheel's center, and took a moment to let her breathing match the unhurried pace of the morning. When she began kicking the lower wheel with her right foot, the mechanism turned with a familiar creaking sound that soon smoothed into a steady rotation. Her clay-dusty hands cupped the spinning clay, and she reached for the bowl of water beside the wheel, wetting her fingers before centering the material. The clay moved beneath her palms, wobbling slightly at first, then gradually finding its balance as she applied gentle, consistent pressure. The workshop filled with the quiet sounds of the craft, the soft slap of wet clay, the rhythmic creak of the wheel, her own steady breathing, and the occasional drip of water from her hands back into the bowl. Cecilia's graying auburn hair had come slightly loose from beneath her cap, but she left it, focused instead on the sensation of clay responding to her touch. This was the part of the work that always brought her deepest contentment, feeling the material come alive and cooperative beneath her fingers. She pressed her thumbs into the center of the spinning clay, creating an opening that would become the interior of a bowl. The walls rose slowly as she coaxed them upward with gentle pressure from inside and out, supporting the clay as it stretched and thinned. Her movements showed the patience that had always defined her approach to the craft, never forcing or rushing, simply guiding the clay toward the shape it seemed willing to become. The morning progressed in this peaceful manner, with Cecilia completing one vessel and then another. Each bowl or jar took its place on the shelf beside the window, where air could circulate around the pieces and begin the slow process of drying. Between turns, she cleaned the wheel with a damp cloth and prepared fresh clay, maintaining the rhythm of work that felt as natural as breathing. When the bells rang for sext at midday, she set aside her tools and moved to the small hearth at the back of the workshop. A clay pot hung from an iron hook, containing yesterday's pottage thick with barley and root vegetables, flavored with herbs from the kitchen garden. She built up the fire with careful attention, adding small sticks of dry wood until flames licked around the pot's base, and the scent of warming food began to fill the space. While the meal heated, Cecilia washed her hands in a wooden basin, watching the water turn cloudy with dissolved clay. The liquid felt tepid against her skin, neither warm nor cold, and she dried her palms on a length of linen before ladling pottage into a wooden bowl. The food tasted earthy and nourishing, each spoonful carrying the simple flavors of turnip and leek softened by long cooking, and she ate slowly while looking out through the workshop door at the village beyond. The mist had lifted by now, revealing thatched roofs and narrow lanes where chickens scratched in the dirt, and a dog dozed in a patch of weak autumn sunshine. A neighbor passed by with a basket of wool, calling out a greeting that Cecilia returned with a wave of her hand. The village moved at its own unhurried pace, everyone occupied with their particular work, and the potter felt the comfortable sense of belonging that came from knowing her place in this web of daily life. After eating, she returned to the wheel and spent the afternoon shaping larger vessel storage jars that would be used for keeping grain or preserving food through the coming winter. These required more clay and more careful attention to keep the walls even as they rose higher, but Cecilia's clay-dusty hands moved with practiced confidence. She added coils of clay to build up the sides, smoothing each addition into the layer below until no seam remained visible. The light gradually changed as afternoon wore toward evening, growing more golden and slanting at a lower angle through the window. Cecilia, 29, felt the pleasant tiredness in her shoulders and back that came from hours of focused work, though it was the satisfying kind of fatigue that spoke of tasks accomplished rather than mere exhaustion. She hummed her wordless tune while finishing the last jar, her graying auburn hair now quite loose around her face, catching the amber light. When the vessel was complete, she used the wire to cut it free from the wheel, lifting it carefully and carrying it to join the others on the drying shelf. The row of new pieces pleased her observant eye, each shape slightly different, but all sharing a similar grace, functional beauty born from the marriage of skilled hands and willing clay. She cleaned her tools methodically, wiping each one before hanging it in its proper place, and dampened the remaining clay to keep it workable for tomorrow. The workshop slowly settled into evening stillness as Cecilia performed these closing rituals. She checked the vessels one more time, turning each slightly to ensure even drying, and banked the hearth fire so coals would remain until morning. The scent of clay and wood smoke and cooling earth filled the dimming space, and through the door she could see the first stars beginning to appear in a sky that had cleared to pale lavender streaked with coral. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her clay-dusty hands resting loosely at her sides, and felt the deep contentment that always came at day's end. The potter's wheel waited silently in the gathering dusk, ready for tomorrow's turning, and somewhere in the village, the evening bells would soon ring to mark the close of another gentle day in Ashbourne, where red clay became vessels and skilled hands shaped beauty from the earth itself. The evening had brought cooler air that drifted through the open workshop door, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from cooking fires throughout the village. Cecilia made her way along the narrow lane toward her cottage, her worn leather shoes finding the familiar path even as twilight deepened around her. The day's work had left a pleasant heaviness in her limbs, and she moved with the same unhurried grace that marked all her actions, pausing occasionally to exchange quiet words with neighbors preparing for the night ahead. Her cottage stood at the edge of the village, a modest structure with walls of wattle and daub, and a roof thatched with straw that had weathered to a pale gold. She pushed open the wooden door, which swung inward with a comfortable creak, and entered the single room that served as both living space and sleeping quarters. The interior held the familiar scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, lavender and thyme, and rosemary gathered during the summer months' end. The air felt slightly warmer than outside, still holding some memory of the morning's fire. Cecilia, 29 years old, moved to the central hearth and knelt to rebuild the fire from the embers that glowed faintly beneath the ash. She added kindling first, small twigs that caught quickly and sent up delicate flames, then placed larger pieces of wood across them with careful attention to allow air to feed the growing fire. The light gradually filled the cottage, casting dancing shadows against the plastered walls and illuminating the simple furnishings: a wooden bed frame with a straw mattress, a table and bench, shelves holding wooden bowls, and a few clay vessels she had made herself. The warmth spread outward from the hearth as the fire established itself, and she filled a clay pot with water from the bucket near the door, setting it on an iron trivet to heat. While waiting, she unwound the linen cap from her head, freeing her graying auburn hair completely, and combed through it with her fingers to remove the dust and tangles accumulated during the day's work. Her clay-dusty hands moved gently through the strands, patient as always, working out each knot without hurry or frustration. When the water had warmed, she poured some into a wooden basin and washed more thoroughly than the quick rinse at the workshop had allowed. The cloth she used grew dark with dissolved clay, and she scrubbed her arms up to the elbows, watching the terracotta-tinted water swirl in the basin. The sensation of becoming clean brought its own kind of contentment, a transition from the workday into the quieter hours of evening, and she hummed that same wordless tune while drying herself on a length of linen. By the time darkness had fully settled outside, Cecilia had changed into a clean shift and wrapped a woolen shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. She sat on the bench near the fire, a wooden bowl of barley porridge in her lap, eating slowly while the flames provided both light and companionship. The porridge tasted mild and nourishing, sweetened with a small amount of honey, and each spoonful warmed her from within as the fire warmed her from without. The cottage held a deep stillness broken only by the occasional pop and crackle from the burning wood. Through the small window opening, covered with oiled cloth that let through a dim glow from the rising moon, she could hear the distant sound of the night settling over Ashbourne dogs barking somewhere toward the village center, the hoot of an owl in the trees beyond the fields, the gentle rustling of wind through the thatch above her head. After finishing her meal, she set the bowl aside and reached for the basket of wool that sat near the hearth. Spinning provided occupation for the evening hours, a task that required attention but not the intense focus of working clay, and her hands welcomed the familiar feel of carded fleece. She drew out a length of fiber, twisting it as she fed it onto the drop spindle, and the weight hung suspended below her fingers, turning slowly as the wool transformed into thread. The rhythm of spinning matched the peaceful pace of the evening itself. Draw, twist, wind, draw again. Cecilia's graying auburn hair caught the firelight as she worked, and her observant nature noted how the thread formed evenly beneath her clay-dusty hands, which never quite lost all traces of her craft no matter how thoroughly she washed. The wool felt soft and slightly oily from the lanolin still present in the fibers, and the growing length of spun thread on the spindle showed steady progress toward yarn that could eventually be woven into cloth. Time passed in this tranquil manner, measured only by the fire burning lower and the length of thread increasing on the spindle. The work required just enough attention to keep her hands occupied, but left her mind free to wander through pleasant, drowsy thoughts. The vessels waiting on the workshop shelves, the satisfaction of clay centered perfectly on the wheel, the way autumn light had filled the workspace that afternoon with its particular golden quality. When her eyes began to feel heavy, and the spindle seemed to turn more slowly in her loosening grip, Cecilia set the wool aside and prepared for sleep. She banked the fire carefully, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night, and the cottage dimmed to near darkness, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the window cloth. She made her way to the bed frame, her feet padding softly across the packed earth floor, and settled onto the straw mattress with a sigh of deep contentment. The woolen blankets she pulled over herself held the day's warmth, and she adjusted them until they lay just so, creating a cocoon of comfort against the cool night air. Her head rested on a pillow stuffed with wool and dried lavender, releasing a faint herbal scent when she shifted, and gradually her breathing slowed to match the peaceful rhythm of the sleeping village around her. In the darkness, she could still sense the familiar outlines of her cottage, the shelves along the wall, the banked hearth glowing faintly, the basket of wool waiting for tomorrow evening. Her clay-dusty hands, finally clean and resting on the blanket, had earned their rest, and Cecilia, 29 years old, let herself drift toward sleep with the satisfaction of knowing that morning would bring the wheels turning again, and clay ready to be shaped, and all the gentle certainty of work she understood completely. The night deepened over Ashbourne, and in her cottage at the village edge, the potter slept as peacefully as the vessels resting on their shelves, waiting for the fire that would transform them from fragile earth into lasting stone. The next day arrived with rain, a steady autumn downpour that drummed against the thatch and turned the village lanes into channels of mud. Cecilia woke to the sound of water, a soothing percussion that varied between soft patter and heavier rushes when the wind gusted. She lay still for a moment, warm beneath her blankets, listening to the rain speak its liquid language against the roof, before finally rising and rekindling the fire from last night's preserved coals. The cottage filled gradually with warmth and the smell of porridge cooking over the renewed flames. She ate her morning meal while watching rain stream down the oiled cloth covering the window, distorting the gray light beyond into wavering patterns. The weather meant she would spend the day entirely within the workshop rather than gathering clay from the riverbank as she had planned. But this change brought no disappointment. There was always work to be done, and rainy days had their own particular comfort. She wrapped her woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders before venturing outside, pulling the hood up over her graying auburn hair, and made the short journey to the workshop through rain that immediately began soaking into the fabric. The air smelled of wet earth and clean water, that fresh scent that autumn rains brought, and her worn leather shoes squelched in the mud with each step. By the time she reached the workshop door, her cloak was heavy with moisture, and her face was damp with mist. Inside, the space felt cool and dim, the rain light coming through the window providing less illumination than yesterday's sunshine had offered. Cecilia shook out her cloak and hung it near the door to dry, then moved to build up the fire in the hearth. The flames grew slowly, reluctant in the damp air, but eventually caught and began providing both warmth and light to supplement the gray daylight filtering through the oiled linen window covering. The vessels on the drying shelves demanded her attention first. In weather like this, clay dries more slowly, which could be either blessing or complication depending on the circumstances. She examined each piece carefully, her clay-dusty hands hovering just above the surfaces to gauge their dampness without leaving fingerprints. The bowls she had made yesterday remained slightly soft to the touch, while the older pieces from earlier in the week had progressed further toward the leather-hard stage ideal for trimming and final shaping. Cecilia, 29, selected one of these older vessels ajar with a rounded belly and narrow neckhand, carried it to her work table. The trimming process required different tools than throwing on the wheel, and she chose a curved metal scraper worn to perfect thinness by years of use. Inverting the jar and securing it carefully, she began shaving away excess clay from the base, working with the patient attention that characterized all her movements. The scraper produced thin curls of clay that fell away like wood shavings, accumulating on the table in delicate spirals. The sound of metal against firm clay provided a steady whisper beneath the rain's percussion, and Cecilia hummed her wordless tune while working, finding the rhythm that made trimming feel like meditation rather than mere labor. Her observant nature guided the tool, nodding where the wall thickness varied and adjusting her pressure to create an even surface. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming, and the workshop became a sheltered haven filled with the mingled scents of damp clay, wood smoke, and wet earth. Occasionally, a stronger gust of wind would rattle the door in its frame or send a scatter of heavier drops against the window covering. But these interruptions only emphasized the coziness of the interior space. The fire crackled companionably, and the light from the flames cast warm tones across the clay vessels waiting on their shelves. When the jar's base had been trimmed to satisfaction, she set it aside and reached for another piece, this time a wide, shallow bowl perfect for serving food at table. The trimming process repeated itself with small variations, her hands knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, where to remove material, and where to leave it. The work brought that deep contentment she always felt when fully engaged with her craft, a state where time seemed to slow and expand, measured not by the passing hours, but by the completion of each small, perfect task. By mid-morning, when the bells for terce rang across the rainy village, she had trimmed 6 vessels and arranged them back on the shelves in order of their drying progression. Her shoulders held that pleasant tiredness that came from sustained focus, and she paused to stretch slightly, rolling her neck and flexing her clay-dusty hands before moving to check the supplies in the storage area. The rain had created ideal conditions for preparing slip liquid clay used for decoration and joining pieces together. Cecilia gathered a portion of dried clay scraps she had saved for this purpose, pieces too small for throwing but valuable nonetheless, and placed them in a ceramic bowl. She added water gradually, stirring with a wooden paddle, and watched the dry fragments dissolve and soften into a smooth, creamy mixture the consistency of thick cream. The slip would need straining to remove any lumps or impurities, so she set up a second bowl with a piece of fine linen stretched across the top, secured with cord tied around the rim. Pouring the mixture slowly through the fabric, she allowed the liquid clay to filter into the container below while any coarse particles remained caught in the cloth. The process took time, requiring patience as the slip dripped through at its own pace, but Cecilia simply hummed and tended the fire while waiting, occasionally adding more mixture to the linen filter. When the straining was complete, she had a bowl of perfectly smooth slip, terracotta colored and ready for use. She set it aside to settle further, knowing that by afternoon it would have reached the ideal consistency for applying decorative patterns to vessels. The filtered out impurities she scraped from the linen and added to the wedging clay, wasting nothing, honoring the material by using every bit that could still serve a purpose. The morning progressed in this manner, moving between tasks with the easy flow of long practice. Cecilia checked the drying pieces again, rotated them to ensure even air exposure, and prepared additional clay for the wheel. The rain continued outside, sometimes heavier and sometimes lighter, but always present, turning the day into a soft gray cocoon of sound and steady work. Her graying auburn hair had been tucked back beneath her linen cap, though a few strands had escaped to curl slightly in the damp air near her face. When midday arrived, she heated more pottage over the hearth fire, the same pot as yesterday but replenished with fresh vegetables and more water. The food simmered gently, filling the workshop with savory warmth, and she ate standing near the fire, looking out through the half-open door at the rain falling steadily on the village beyond. Chickens huddled beneath the eaves of nearby buildings, their feathers fluffed against the weather, and a cat darted across the lane seeking shelter with its tail held low. After the meal, Cecilia returned to the wheel, ready to throw despite the rain, or perhaps because of it there was something especially satisfying about creating while listening to water fall from the sky. She positioned herself on the bench, centered a wedged portion of clay on the wheel head, and began kicking the lower wheel into motion. Her clay-dusty hands cupped the spinning material, and she wetted her fingers in the water bowl before applying pressure to center the clay. The familiar sensations enveloped her, the cool dampness of the clay, the steady rotation beneath her palms, the gradual transformation as the material found its balance. She opened the centered clay with her thumbs, creating a hollow that would become a cup this time, something smaller and more delicate than yesterday's bowls. The walls rose beneath her guiding fingers, thinning as they climbed, curving inward slightly near the rim to create a pleasing shape for drinking. Cup after cup took form on the wheel, each one similar but unique, bearing the subtle marks of handwork that distinguished them from one another. Cecilia, 29 years old, felt her breathing synchronize with the wheels turning, her whole being focused on the conversation between her hands and the clay. The rain provided a constant backdrop of sound, neither distracting nor demanding attention, simply present the way breath was present, the way heartbeat was present, essential and rhythmic and peaceful. The afternoon light, filtered through rain and oiled linen, remained constant and gray, showing no strong sense of time's passage. Only the gradual accumulation of finished cups on the shelf and the slow tiring of her leg from kicking the wheel marked the hours going by. When finally she completed the last cup she intended to make that day, Cecilia cleaned the wheel head and arranged the new pieces alongside the earlier work, creating a small gallery of forms in various stages of transformation from soft clay to finished vessel. She spent the remaining hours of daylight applying slip decoration to some of the leather-hard pieces that had dried enough to accept it. Using a fine brush made from tied plant fibers, she painted simple patterns lines that spiraled around the shoulders of jars, dots arranged in rhythmic sequences, waves that echoed the rain still falling outside. The work required steady hands and careful attention, and her observant nature guided each brushstroke, creating decoration that enhanced the vessel's shapes without overwhelming them. The slip darkened slightly where it touched the clay, creating subtle contrast that would become more pronounced after firing. Cecilia worked with the deep contentment that always filled her when fully engaged with her craft, aware of the rain, the fire's warmth at her back, the comfortable ache in her shoulders, and the growing collection of decorated vessels that would soon be ready for the kiln. Her graying auburn hair caught the firelight when she turned her head, and her clay-dusty hands moved with confidence born from years of practice. When the light began failing toward evening and her eyes grew tired from the close work, she set aside the brush and cleaned her tools once more. The workshop settled into its nightly quiet, the fire burning low, the rain still pattering steadily against the roof. She dampened the remaining clay, covered the slip bowl to prevent drying, and stood in the doorway looking out at the wet village where lamps were beginning to glow in cottage windows like small, warm stars scattered through the darkness. The walk back to her cottage took her through rain that had gentled to a fine mist, cool against her face and hands. Her worn leather shoes found the muddy path through long familiarity, and she carried with her the satisfaction of a day well spent, hours filled with purposeful work, and the quiet pleasures of craft practiced with love and patience in a workshop that smelled of clay and rain, and the ancient, patient turning of the wheel. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the village washed clean, and the air crisp with the scent of wet earth and grass. Cecilia woke to birdsong filtering through the cottage window, a chorus of sparrows and thrushes welcoming the return of clear skies, and she rose from her bed with the slow, easy movement of someone whose body had rested well. The cottage felt cool in the early light, and she wrapped her woolen shawl around her shoulders before rebuilding the fire from the carefully banked coals that had survived the night. While her morning porridge cooked, she stood in the doorway watching the village come to life beneath a pale blue sky streaked with high, thin clouds. Puddles dotted the lane, reflecting fragments of sky like scattered mirrors, and the thatch on cottage roof steamed slightly as the first sunlight touched the moisture-heavy straw. A neighbor's rooster crowed somewhere nearby, announcing the day with insistent repetition, and Cecilia smiled at the familiar sound before returning inside to eat her meal. The walk to the workshop took her past gardens where rain-heavy vegetables bent toward the earth, and chickens scratched enthusiastically in mud still soft from yesterday's downpour. She exchanged greetings with the baker's wife, who was carrying a basket of fresh loaves toward the market square, and paused briefly to admire a tabby cat washing its face in a patch of emerging sunshine. Her worn leather shoes accumulated fresh mud, and her graying auburn hair, tucked beneath her linen cap, caught the morning breeze that carried hints of autumn's deepening. Inside the workshop, the air held the concentrated scent of clay that always intensified after rain, as if the damp weather had awakened something fundamental in the material itself. Cecilia, 29 years old, moved first to check the vessels on the drying shelves, finding them progressed nicely despite yesterday's humidity. The cups she had thrown during the rainstorm had begun their transformation toward leather hard, and the slip-decorated jars from the afternoon showed their patterns clearly now, the darker lines standing out against the terracotta clay. She built up the hearth fire with the patient attention she brought to all tasks, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood until flames rose steadily, and warmth began spreading through the space. The morning light streamed through the window with renewed brightness after the gray day previous, casting sharp shadows and illuminating the workspace with clarity that made every detail visible. Dust motes drifted through the sunbeams, and the wooden surfaces of her tools gleamed where years of handling had polished them smooth. Today would be a preparation day. She decided readying vessels for firing required specific timing and attention that worked best when devoted to that single purpose. The kiln stood outside, behind the workshop, a beehive-shaped structure built from clay bricks and reinforced with stone. It needed checking before any firing could begin, and Cecilia made her way through the back door to inspect it in the clear morning light. The kiln rose to perhaps twice her height, with a small opening at the base for stoking the fire and a larger door at shoulder level for loading vessels. She crouched near the firebox entrance, peering inside to check that no debris had accumulated and that the floor remained level and clean. The interior walls showed the characteristic discoloration from many previous firings areas of darker clay, where heat had been most intense, lighter patches near the edges, and the subtle rainbow sheen of ash glaze that had formed over countless cycles of heating and cooling. Satisfied with the kiln's condition, she returned to the workshop and began the careful process of selecting which pieces were ready for firing. This required judgment developed over years of practice, and her clay-dusty hands moved from vessel to vessel, tapping gently to listen to the sound each made. Leather-hard pieces rang with a particular tone, neither the dull thud of wet clay nor the bright ping of fired ceramic, but something between a sound that spoke of readiness, of moisture content that had decreased just enough to withstand the kiln's intense heat without cracking or exploding. She chose 12 pieces for this, firing a mixture of bowls, cups, and the larger storage jars she had shaped earlier in the week. Each vessel received final inspection, her observant nature noting any small imperfections that needed addressing before they became permanent. A slight roughness on one bowl's rim received attention from a damp sponge, until the edge felt completely smooth beneath her fingertips. A cup with an almost imperceptible wobble in its base got set aside for reworking, rather than risk it toppling during the firing process. The selected vessels she arranged on a wooden board near the back door, organizing them by size and considering how they would stack within the kiln's interior space. Efficient loading meant maximizing the number of pieces while ensuring heat could circulate freely around each one, and this puzzle-like arrangement always engaged the part of her mind that found satisfaction in solving practical problems with elegant solutions. By the time the bells rang for terce, Cecilia had completed her selection and inspection. She took a brief rest, sitting on the bench near the hearth with a cup of weak ale and a piece of bread with cheese, watching the strengthening sunlight move across the workshop floor as morning progressed toward midday. The fire crackled companionably, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice before falling silent, leaving only the ambient sounds of the village going about its collective work. Hammer strikes from the blacksmith's forge, children's voices raised in some game, the creak of a cart passing by on the lane. After eating, she began the process of loading the kiln. Each vessel had to be carried carefully from workshop to kiln, and she made multiple trips, moving with the unhurried grace that characterized all her actions. The larger jars went in first, positioned on the kiln floor with space between them for heat circulation. Medium-sized bowls stacked above, each one supported by small clay stilts that kept them from touching while allowing hot air to flow around their surfaces. The work demanded careful attention and steady hands, and Cecilia, 29 years old, hummed her wordless tune while arranging each piece with the precise care of someone who understood that haste in this task could mean disaster later. Her graying auburn hair had come slightly loose from beneath her cap, and she paused occasionally to tuck the stray strands back, her clay-dusty hands leaving faint smudges on the linen fabric. When all 12 vessels sat secure in their positions, she stood back to review the arrangement one final time, making small adjustments to spacing here and there, until everything felt exactly right. The kiln door, a heavy clay and brick structure that fit snugly into the opening, waited nearby. But she would not seal it yet. First came the slow, gentle pre-warming phase that would drive out any remaining moisture without shocking the clay into cracking. She gathered kindling and small pieces of wood, building a modest fire in the firebox at the kiln's base. The flames caught quickly in the dry fuel, and thin smoke began rising from the kiln's chimney opening at the top. The heat would build gradually over the next several hours, following the patient rhythm that good firing demanded, never rushed, always attentive to the clay's needs rather than human impatience. With the fire established, Cecilia returned to the workshop and settled at her wheel for the afternoon's throwing. The routine of the day continued its gentle unfolding, wedging clay, centering it on the wheel, opening and raising walls into new forms. Cup after cup emerged from beneath her guiding fingers, each one destined for eventual use at someone's table, holding ale or water or perhaps warm spiced cider during the cold months ahead. The light shifted as afternoon progressed, taking on that particular golden quality of autumn days when the sun hangs lower in the sky and shadows grow longer. She paused periodically to check the kiln, adding more fuel to maintain the gentle warming fire, never letting it grow too hot or burn too fast. The smoke rising from the chimney remained thin and pale, a good sign that combustion was clean and temperature was climbing steadily without dangerous spikes. Between throwing sessions, she prepared clay for future work, wedging large portions and storing them beneath damp cloths to stay workable. Her shoulders held that familiar pleasant tiredness, and her leg muscles felt the sustained effort of kicking the wheel, but these sensations spoke of honest work rather than strain. The deep contentment that always came when fully engaged with her craft settled over her like the afternoon light itself, warm, golden, completely peaceful. When the day began easing toward evening, the kiln had progressed through its initial warming phase and was ready for the door to be sealed. Cecilia fitted the heavy closure into place, using clay slip mixed with sand to seal any gaps where heat might escape or cold air intrude. The work required strength, and she grunted slightly with effort while pressing the slip into crevices, but her patient nature never wavered. When complete, the kiln stood closed and secure, ready for the long firing that would transform soft clay into permanent ceramic. She built up the fire in the firebox, adding larger pieces of wood now that the vessels had been warmed through and could withstand more intense heat. The flames roared louder, and the smoke from the chimney thickened, taking on a darker tone as temperature climbed toward the point where clay would begin its fundamental transformation. This phase would continue through the night, requiring periodic stoking to maintain heat, and Cecilia had made her preparations accordingly. Near the kiln, she had arranged supplies for the long watch ahead, a pile of split firewood stacked within easy reach, a water jug and cup for drinking, a woolen blanket to wrap around her shoulders when the night grew cold, and a small stool to sit on during the hours between stoking. The work of firing demanded this vigil, this patient tending of flame through darkness, and she had performed it countless times, finding in it a particular kind of meditation that came from being awake while the village slept, watching fire transform earth into something new and lasting. As twilight deepened into true darkness, stars emerged overhead in a sky cleared completely by yesterday's rain. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the crisp edge of autumn nights, and Cecilia wrapped the blanket around her shoulders while settling onto the stool near the kiln. The structure radiated heat now, warming her face and hands when she leaned close to peer through the spy hole, a small opening in the door that allowed glimpses of the glowing interior. Inside, the vessels had begun to show the dull red glow that indicated rising temperature, their shapes visible as darker silhouettes against the brightening heat. She added more wood to the firebox, and the flames responded with renewed vigor, crackling and popping as they consumed the fuel. Sparks rose toward the chimney opening, and the night around her seemed to grow more intimate, defined by the circle of firelight and the steady warmth radiating from the kiln's clay walls. The hours passed in this manner, measured by wood added and temperature assessed, and the slow rotation of stars across the clear sky overhead. Cecilia, 29 years old, sat wrapped in her blanket, her graying auburn hair visible in the firelight when the blanket slipped back from her head. She hummed occasionally, wordless notes that blended with the fire's crackling, and her clay-dusty hands remained busy with the work of keeping fuel moving to the flames. Sometime deep in the night, when the village lay completely silent, and even the dogs had ceased their occasional barking, the kiln reached the temperature where transformation became complete. The vessels inside glowed bright orange now, visible through the spy hole as shapes of pure light, and Cecilia knew from long experience that this was the moment to begin gradually reducing the fuel, allowing temperature to plateau rather than climb further. She fed the fire more slowly, spacing the additions of wood to maintain heat without increasing it, and settled more deeply into her blanket as the night's coldest hours approached. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere an owl called from the trees beyond the village, receiving an answering call from another owl farther away. The sounds emphasized the stillness rather than breaking it, like stones dropped into a deep, quiet pool. Her eyelids grew heavy during the long watches between stoking, but she never fully slept, maintaining that half-aware state where consciousness floated just beneath the surface, ready to rouse completely when the fire needed tending. The kiln stood like a glowing sentinel in the darkness, its chimney breathing steady plumes of smoke that rose straight upward in the still night air, and Cecilia kept her vigil with the patient attention that had always defined her approach to this craft she loved. Dawn came eventually, as it always did, with pale light spreading from the east and birdsong beginning tentatively, before growing into a full-voiced chorus. The fire in the kiln had burned down to steady coals, and the temperature inside was beginning its slow, natural decline. Cecilia stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in her back and legs from the long night of intermittent sitting, and walked a slow circle around the kiln to restore circulation to her limbs. The village began waking around her, smoke rising from cottage chimneys as morning fires were lit, doors opening, voices calling greetings across the lanes. She allowed the kiln to cool at its own pace, adding no more fuel, simply monitoring the temperature's gradual drop through the spy hole. The vessels inside had faded from bright orange to dull red to a dark glow that eventually disappeared completely, leaving only heat without visible light. By mid-morning, when she felt confident the cooling process was well underway and nothing required immediate attention, Cecilia made her way back to her cottage. Her worn leather shoes felt heavy on her feet, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs. But underneath ran a current of satisfaction. The firing had progressed beautifully, and tomorrow or the next day, when the kiln had cooled completely, she would open it to discover how the vessels had transformed in the flame's embrace. She ate a simple meal of bread and cheese without bothering to heat anything, then lay down on her bed, still wearing her clay-dusty work dress, pulling the woolen blankets over her body. Sleep came immediately, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone whose work was honest, and whose body had earned its rest through patient labor, tending fire through the darkness, watching earth become stone, honoring the ancient craft of shaping beauty from the patient turning of the wheel. The afternoon sun was slanting through the cottage window when Cecilia woke, her body heavy with the particular weariness that came after a night spent tending fire. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the village going about its daily business, chickens clucking in someone's yard, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, children laughing as they played some game in the lane. The blankets cocooned her in warmth, and she allowed herself these extra moments of rest before finally rising and splashing cool water on her face from the basin near the hearth. Her cottage felt peaceful in the golden afternoon light, dust motes drifting lazily through the sunbeams, and she moved slowly through the simple tasks of rekindling the fire and heating water for washing. The clay dust that permanently resided in the creases of her palms and beneath her fingernails seemed more pronounced after the night's work, and she scrubbed her clay-dusty hands thoroughly before changing into a clean shift and combing through her graying auburn hair with patient attention to each tangle. By the time she made her way back to the workshop, the day had progressed well into the afternoon. The kiln stood silent and cooling, no longer radiating the intense heat of the previous night, but still too warm to open safely. She circled it slowly, placing her palm against the clay walls at various heights to gauge the temperature drop, and estimated another full day would be needed before the vessels inside could be safely removed. This waiting period was part of the rhythm of firing, as natural as any other phase, and she felt no impatience, only quiet anticipation for the moment when the door would open and reveal what the flames had wrought. Inside the workshop, the wheel waited with its familiar patience. Cecilia, 29 years old, settled onto her bench and began the afternoon's work with the same steady focus she brought to every task. She had orders to fulfill. The innkeeper had requested 6 large serving bowls, and the priest had commissioned a set of cups for the church's modest collection of vessels used during feast days. These commissions provided steady income that supplemented what she earned from selling pieces at the weekly market, and she approached them with the same care she gave to any work, whether paid or made, simply for the pleasure of creation itself. The clay centered smoothly beneath her hands, and she opened the first bowl with her thumbs pressed firmly into the spinning material. The walls rose gradually, spreading outward to create the wide, shallow form the innkeeper needed for serving pottage to travelers. Her movements showed the deep contentment that always filled her when working, a state where breath and motion and thought merged into single-pointed attention on the conversation between her hands and the clay. Bowl after bowl took shape on the wheel, each one similar to its siblings, but bearing those subtle variations that proved human hands had made them. She varied her kicking rhythm slightly with each piece, allowing the wheel's speed to influence the final form in small ways, and the collection that accumulated on the drying shelf showed a family resemblance while maintaining individual character. Her graying auburn hair had been tucked carefully beneath her cap this time, secured with the knowledge of someone who had learned that loose strands could become nuisances during focused work. The light shifted as afternoon eased toward evening, taking on that warm amber quality that made everything seem gentler and more beautiful. Cecilia paused between pieces to flex her hands and roll her shoulders, maintaining the body's ease through small movements that prevented stiffness from settling into her muscles. She hummed her wordless tune while wedging fresh clay, the melody as familiar as breathing, and the workshop filled with the peaceful sounds of the wheel's rhythmic creak, the soft impact of clay being slapped and folded, her own quiet breathing keeping time with the work. When the serving bowls were complete, she cleaned her wheel and turned her attention to the cups for the church. These needed to be smaller and more delicate than everyday drinking vessels, with walls thin enough to seem refined but thick enough to withstand regular use. She adjusted her technique accordingly, using lighter pressure and more careful attention to the clay's response, coaxing rather than forcing the material into the desired shape. The first cup emerged graceful and light, its rim curving slightly inward to make drinking comfortable. She set it aside to begin firming and started the next, finding the rhythm of repetition that made producing multiple similar pieces feel meditative rather than tedious. Her clay-dusty hands moved with confidence born from years of practice, knowing exactly how much water to use, when to apply pressure, and when to ease off, reading the clay's willingness through sensations too subtle to name, but completely familiar to her fingers. By the time the church bells rang for vespers, marking the evening prayer hour, she had completed all 6 cups and arranged them on the shelf beside the serving bowls. The workshop had grown dim as daylight faded, and she lit a tall candle that cast wavering light across the clay vessels and threw dancing shadows against the walls. The flame's scent mingled with the ever-present smell of clay, creating an atmosphere of warmth and industry that felt deeply satisfying after the long day's work. She cleaned her tools methodically in the candlelight, wiping each one before hanging it in its proper place, and dampened the remaining clay for tomorrow's use. The kiln outside continued its slow cooling, and she stepped out briefly to check it one final time before leaving for the night. The structure still radiated warmth when she placed her hand near it, but the heat had diminished considerably from this morning's intensity, and she nodded to herself in satisfaction. By tomorrow afternoon, the opening could safely proceed. The walk back to her cottage took her through a village settling into evening routines. Cooking fires had been built up, and the scent of baking bread drifted from several doorways. A group of women stood talking near the well, their voices rising and falling in the pleasant rhythm of shared gossip and news, and they called greetings to Cecilia as she passed. She waved in return, her worn leather shoes finding the familiar path even as twilight deepened into true darkness overhead. At home, she prepared a simple supper of vegetable pottage heated over her hearth fire, adding a handful of dried herbs that released their fragrance into the steaming broth. The meal tasted earthy and nourishing, each spoonful warming her from within, and she ate slowly while watching the fire cast its shifting patterns of light and shadow across the cottage walls. The day's work had left her pleasantly tired, but not exhausted, the kind of fatigue that spoke of tasks accomplished, and time well spent rather than mere depletion. After eating, she took up her spinning again, drawing wool fibers onto the drop spindle with the same patient rhythm she brought to all her work. The thread grew steadily, winding onto the spindle's shaft, and her mind drifted through comfortable thoughts while her hands maintained their steady motion. She thought of the vessels cooling in the kiln, imagining their transformed surfaces, the warm terracotta color deepened by fire, any slip decoration now permanently bonded to the clay, small variations in temperature creating subtle shifts in hue that made each piece unique. The spinning continued until her eyelids grew heavy, and the firelight seemed to blur and soften at the edges of her vision. Cecilia, 29 years old, set aside the spindle and prepared for bed with the slow, drowsy movements of someone ready for sleep. She banked the fire carefully, changed into her sleeping shift, and settled beneath the woolen blankets with a sigh of deep contentment that came from knowing her work was progressing well, and tomorrow would bring the joy of opening the kiln. Sleep came easily, wrapping around her like the blankets themselves, and she drifted into darkness with her clay-dusty hands resting loosely on the covers, and her graying auburn hair spread across the pillow stuffed with lavender and wool. Outside, the village grew quiet as lamps were extinguished, and families settled into their own rest, and above it all the autumn stars wheeled slowly through a clear sky, while the cooling kiln held its secrets for one more night. Morning arrived with mist again, a light fog that softened all the edges of the world and muffled sounds into gentle whispers. Cecilia woke to this gray-white dimness pressing against her window and felt a momentary disorientation before memory returned. Today was the kiln opening, the moment when she would discover how the firing had transformed her vessels. Anticipation brought her fully awake, and she rose quickly, building up the fire and eating a hurried breakfast of yesterday's bread with honey before making her way through the misty lanes toward the workshop. The kiln emerged from the fog like a patient sentinel, its beehive shape darker than the surrounding air. She approached it slowly and placed both hands flat against the clay walls, feeling for any residual heat. The surface was warm but not hot, cool enough that opening could proceed safely. Her heart beat a little faster with the excitement that always accompanied this moment, no matter how many times she had performed this ritual. She began removing the clay and sand mixture that sealed the door, working carefully to avoid jarring the kiln or its contents. The seal came away in chunks and crumbles, revealing the edge of the door itself, and when enough had been removed, she grasped the door's handles and pulled steadily. The heavy clay and brick structure resisted for a moment before sliding free with a grinding sound, and she set it aside before peering into the shadowy interior. Even in the dim light filtering through fog, she could see the vessels arranged on their stilts and supports, and her breath caught slightly at the sight. The firing had gone beautifully. Each piece showed the rich terracotta color she had hoped for, deepened and enriched by the flame's embrace. The slip decoration on the jars had turned a darker reddish brown, creating the subtle contrast she had envisioned, and nowhere could she see the telltale cracks or warping that indicated problems during firing. Cecilia, 29 years old, reached into the kiln carefully and lifted out the first vessel, one of the cups she had made before the rainstorm. It felt different in her hands now, transformed from something fragile and impermanent into an object that could last for generations if treated with reasonable care. The surface had a slight sheen from ash glaze that had formed during the long firing, and when she tapped it gently with her fingernail, it rang with the clear, musical tone of properly fired ceramic. She carried each vessel out reverently, arranging them on a wooden table she had positioned near the kiln for this purpose. Cup after cup, bowl after bowl, the larger jars, last all of them, emerged successfully, each one bearing the marks of its journey through fire while maintaining the essential form she had given them on the wheel. Her clay-dusty hands touched each piece with care, checking for any hairline cracks or weak spots, but found only sound ceramic, well fired and ready for use. By the time all 12 vessels sat on the table, the morning mist had begun lifting, and pale sunlight filtered through the thinning fog. She stood looking at the collection with that deep contentment that came from work completed successfully, from seeing raw earth transformed into beautiful, functional objects through the application of skill and patience and fire. Her graying auburn hair caught the emerging sunlight, and she allowed herself a smile of quiet satisfaction before carefully carrying the vessels inside to the workshop shelves, where they would await delivery to their eventual owners. The rest of the morning passed in the peaceful rhythm of cleanup and preparation. She swept out the kiln's interior, removing ash and any debris that had accumulated, and checked the firebox for any problems that might need addressing before the next firing. The kiln walls showed no new cracks, and the floor remained level and sound, everything ready for the cycle to begin again when enough pieces had accumulated to warrant another firing. Inside the workshop, she returned to the wheel and began throwing more everyday vessels, simple bowls and cups that would be sold at market, the bread and butter work that sustained her livelihood between special commissions. The clay centered smoothly beneath her patient hands, and she opened vessel after vessel while morning progressed toward midday, the sun gradually burning away the last traces of fog until the village emerged clear and bright in autumn light. When the bells rang for sext, she paused to eat bread and cheese, standing near the open workshop door and watching the life of Ashbourne unfold before her. A cart laden with apples rumbled past, heading toward the market square. Children ran by chasing a leather ball, their voices high and excited. An old man walked slowly with a stick, pausing to rest on a stone wall before continuing his journey. The ordinary scenes of village life, unchanging in their essentials across the years, and Cecilia felt her place within this web of community, the potter who made vessels for everyday use, whose work touched every household in small but necessary ways. The afternoon brought visitors to the workshop. First came the innkeeper, a round-faced man with cheerful eyes, to collect his serving bowls. He examined each one carefully, testing their weight and balance, and nodded approval before counting out the agreed-upon payment in silver pennies. Cecilia wrapped the bowls in straw and helped him load them into his cart, and they exchanged a few words about the weather and the upcoming harvest festival before he departed with a wave. Later, the priest arrived for his cups, moving with the measured dignity his position required. He was an elderly man with gentle hands and kind eyes, and he handled each cup reverently, as if they were already sacred objects rather than simple ceramic vessels. He blessed them quietly before wrapping them in cloth, and when he paid her, he added an extra penny with the suggestion that she might use it to light a candle for her late father's soul. She accepted with thanks, touched by the thoughtfulness, and watched him walk carefully back toward the church, his precious burden cradled in both arms. These transactions completed, Cecilia returned to her wheel with renewed energy, throwing bowls and cups that would be sold at the next market day. Her movements had reached that fluid state where technique disappeared into pure action, hands knowing what to do without conscious direction, and the afternoon passed in productive contentment. Bowl after bowl emerged and joined the growing collection on the drying shelves, each one a small manifestation of skill meeting material, human intention guiding earth toward useful form. The light changed as the day eased toward evening, shadows lengthening across the workshop floor, and Cecilia finally set aside her tools with the satisfied tiredness of someone whose day had been full and productive. She cleaned the wheel one last time, covered the remaining clay, and stood looking around at the workshop shelves filled with vessels in various stages of completion, tools hanging in their proper places, the kiln outside waiting patiently for its next filling, everything ready for tomorrow's continuation of work that felt less like labor and more like meditation, prayer, conversation with ancient earth transformed by patient hands, and enduring fire into objects of simple, lasting beauty. The days that followed settled into the comfortable rhythm that marked the turning of seasons in Ashbourne, each one bringing its own small variations within the larger pattern of work and rest. Cecilia woke each morning to the sound of bells calling the village to prayer, dressed in the dim light before dawn, and made her way to the workshop through air that grew progressively cooler as autumn deepened its hold on the land. The market day arrived with clear skies and a brisk wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Cecilia, 29 years old, loaded her handcart with the vessels she had prepared for selling bowls and cups and small jars, each one wrapped carefully in straw to prevent chipping during transport. The cart's wooden wheels creaked as she pushed it along the rutted lane toward the village square, and her worn leather shoes found purchase on ground that had dried and hardened after the recent rains. The market square had already begun filling with vendors setting up their stalls when she arrived. The baker arranged his loaves in tempting rows, releasing clouds of yeasty steam when he uncovered the fresh batches. The weaver displayed lengths of woolen cloth in natural shades of cream and gray and brown. A farmer's wife positioned baskets of late-season apples and root vegetables, their earthy colors glowing in the morning light. The usual sounds of market morning rose around her greetings called between vendors, the clatter of goods being unloaded, chickens clucking in wooden cages, a donkey braying somewhere nearby. Cecilia claimed her customary spot near the well and began arranging her wares on the wooden planks she had brought for display. Each vessel she positioned with care, turning pieces to show their best angles, grouping similar items together in ways that pleased the eye. Her clay-dusty hands moved with the same patient attention she brought to throwing on the wheel, and gradually her display took shape a modest but attractive collection of functional pottery that showed honest craftsmanship without pretension. The morning progressed as customers began arriving, and she found herself engaged in the gentle commerce of market day. A young woman newly married examined the bowls carefully before selecting 3 for her household, counting out her coins with serious concentration. An older man with gnarled hands chose a large jar for storing grain, testing its weight and nodding approval at the sturdy construction. A mother with 2 small children clinging to her skirts purchased a set of cups, and the children's eyes widened with wonder at the vessel's smooth surfaces and even forms. Between transactions, Cecilia chatted with neighboring vendors, exchanging news and observations about the weather and the harvest and village happenings. The weaver complained mildly about the difficulty of getting good wool this season. The baker shared gossip about the miller's daughter who was being courted by a young man from the next village. The farmer's wife offered her an apple, which Cecilia accepted gratefully, biting into flesh that tasted sweet and slightly tart, crisp with the flavor of autumn itself. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead and the market activity reached its peak, she had sold nearly half her inventory. The coins accumulated in the leather pouch at her belt, creating a pleasant weight that represented security and the ability to purchase what she needed: more firewood for the kiln, food supplies for the coming weeks, perhaps a new piece of linen for a work dress to replace the one growing thin at the elbows. She used some of her earnings to buy provisions before the market ended: a small wheel of cheese, a measure of oats, dried herbs for cooking, and a bundle of rushes for making new lights. These purchases she wrapped carefully and placed beneath her display planks, and when the afternoon began its slow decline toward evening, she packed her remaining unsold vessels back into straw and loaded everything onto her handcart for the journey home. The workshop welcomed her return with its familiar scents and comfortable dimness. She unloaded the cart methodically, returning unsold pieces to their places on the shelves and storing her new provisions in the appropriate locations. The coins from the pouch she counted carefully before placing them in a small ceramic jar. She kept hidden behind a loose stone in the workshop wall her savings, accumulated penny by penny, providing a cushion against unexpected needs or the lean times that occasionally arrived without warning. With market duties complete, she turned her attention back to the wheel and spent the remaining hours of daylight throwing replacement pieces for what had sold. The clay centered beneath her hands with its usual willing cooperation, and vessel after vessel took form in the afternoon light that slanted through the window at increasingly sharp angles. Her graying auburn hair had come slightly loose from beneath her cap, and she paused occasionally to tuck the strands back, leaving faint clay smudges on the linen fabric. The work brought that deep contentment she always felt when fully engaged with her craft, a state where time seemed to slow and expand, measured not by the sun's movement, but by the accumulation of completed forms on the drying shelves. She hummed her wordless tune while working, the melody as much a part of the process as the clay itself, and her clay-dusty hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these motions thousands of times, each repetition deepening the conversation between intention and material. Evening arrived gradually.